I've seen some teams who will they just have a kind of a process that will record, essentially take a recording of the real API and then store it as a mock that can then be sort of played back later for use in their tests. So because they're kind of regularly kind of pulling a mock from the real thing, it remains accurate that way.
Great, Tom, welcome to the show.
Hey, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So maybe we can start off with some basics. Can you introduce yourself? Who are you? What's your background? How did you end up where you are today?
Sure. So I'm Tom Akehurst. I'm a long-time sort of software developer. I worked sort of for in various kind of industries, sometimes consulting, sometimes kind of working in-house at, usually non-tech companies doing tech, if that makes sense. I'm also the creator of an open source tool called Wiremock, which I've been working on since 2011. And more recently, I'm the co-founder and CTO of Wiremock, the company, which is a new startup.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I noticed, when I was kind of looking, stalking you on LinkedIn, you've been the founder of a number of companies. So you kind of have a rich experience across, basically being a technical co-founder and now, at Wiremock, which we'll be talking a fair amount about today. So we're gonna be talking about mock APIs and testing, but maybe before we dive into the details of, mock API and just generally, mocking an API, what are the challenges that you see in the market for engineers that are developing in an environment where, they have lots of API dependencies? How do they go about sort of testing so many external APIs?
So I suppose certainly one of the biggest challenges is around sort of stability and reliability of dev and test environments. Particularly when you have a lot of sort of third-party APIs in your dependency set, things which are kind of built and managed by an organization other than yours. You tend to find you've got this kind of assortment of sandboxes or sandbox modes in other people's software and so on like that you have to contend with in your own dev and test environments. And, obviously there are some companies that invest a lot in their developer experience and do these things very well. But there are also lots of cases where you have to contend with kind of sandboxes that are, broken half the time, flaky, they're sort of used as a place to deploy kind of not properly tested code, all sorts of stuff like that. And if you add all of this up, if you have a whole load of these that your dev and test environments are dependent on, then the likelihood in any given instant of one of these things being broken is very high, and that has a sort of a corresponding negative impact on your team's productivity. So this is the big problem really is how to kind of construct environments where your team can keep shipping software. Even when the sandboxes or equivalent provided by your API providers aren't perfect. I guess the second challenge that I'd draw attention to is just kind of control over the behavior and the data and things like that are in those systems. So if you want to test something involving kind of a large volume of data, say for argument's sake, you're integrated with a social network and you want to test against a profile which has got lots and lots of connections or friends or whatever. The process of setting that profile up and getting it into the kind of shape that you need is can be sort of prohibitively time consuming. If you've got to go and make sort of 500 API calls or whatever to go and set this account up, then that can be very difficult. That sort of thing can be challenging, kind of getting those environments into, those sandboxes into a good state where you can test. And I suppose a final one related to that is the ability to reliably create sort of negative scenarios that that wouldn't normally occur, but you want to test for because they'll happen at some point. Faults and kind of unusual errors, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think there's quite a bit to kind of unpack there. So you mentioned this idea that essentially some companies are not well equipped to essentially deal with this problem of all these third-party API dependencies, and that leads to essentially poor test quality. And you mentioned also during your introduction that you had worked for a lot of like doing tech in a lot of non-tech companies. So is that something that you think is more of an issue in sort of the non-tech companies that are doing tech, or and maybe like the more traditional technology companies are using more sophisticated approaches to this problem? Or do you think this is something that regardless of whether you're a tech company or a non-tech company, it's something that is essentially prevalent across the industries?
I think it's pretty prevalent across all sectors, sort of tech and non-tech. I see plenty of evidence of Wiremock being used in tech companies, for instance. So it's definitely there. I think there's been a particular sort of over the last few years shift towards sort of non-tech companies doing digital transformations and trying to very quickly sort of migrate to a microservice architecture, that kind of thing. So I think there's maybe a certain sort of mode of non-tech companies shifting into a space where they suddenly have these problems very acutely. But certainly, I think any way you're doing any sort of networks, service-based architecture, you're going to have these problems, and I think people are going to be seeking solutions for them.
Yeah, and as we shift to more of like a microservice architecture, then you're adding essentially probably a lot of internal API dependencies as well, not just third-party APIs. So I imagine that ends up compounding the overall problem. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And now you see plenty of sort of companies and products that have this. They have an abundance of both kinds of problems. They have lots of sort of third party, sort of partner and kind of supplier APIs that they integrate with, and they have dozens or even hundreds of internal APIs that they have to integrate with as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one of the other things you mentioned, I think it was the second problem, which was this idea that if you're integrating, say, with a third-party API, and there's just a large payload, like I think the example you gave was around some sort of social network profile. How do you go about like solving that problem? How can you test something like that in a way that's consistent and is going to be similar to what you might be actually experiencing in production?
Well, certainly the way you can do it using mocking is that you're essentially just kind of constructing a request response pair that kind of has exactly the data that you want to have returned. And the benefit of mocking is because you're not building a real API that has business logic and a database and all that kind of stuff. You're kind of mimicking the output of that real API, so you can literally just kind of if you've got a blob of JSON which has got sort of 500 connection kind of items in the list, then you can just generate that blob of JSON or even type it straight into an editor and then just kind of include it in your mock API. So the work involved in getting to something that to the calling system looks exactly like the real thing returning 500 contacts is far lower than having to work with that actual system and get it to return that.
Mm-hmm. And maybe we can back up for a second and sort of define this idea of like a mock API. So what does it actually mean to create a mock API, and then how does that solve this API dependency problem?
So yeah, mock is one of those words, or API mocking is one of those terms that's kind of become, I think, it started meaning lots of different things to different people kind of recently, I think, as there's been an explosion of tools and people kind of figuring out different ways of doing it. I suppose the way I think of it is you are building a sort of a mimic or a simulation of an API which is good enough to solve whatever testing problem you have at hand. And I think that's a deliberately quite variable definition. So in some cases you'll be doing something very small and context specific and not attempting to do to completely replicate an API, whereas at the other end of the scale you might try and build sort of essentially a full simulation of of some other API. Certainly within Wiremock and lots of other sort of tools with similar designs, essentially the essence of it is it boils down to defining when I receive a request that matches a certain pattern, I want to return a particular response. And that's the sort of fundamental, these sort of request pattern to response kind of pairings that you define.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have as many or as few of those as you need, as I say. So in the sort of sort of single unit test case, maybe you only need one. You do one particular you model one particular kind of response in an API, you run the test and you throw it away again, and that's the end of it. Whereas in something sort of richer and more complex, as I say, you may have hundreds of these things to through which you end up defining the entire API that you're mocking.
So in this case where you're mocking APIs, especially I imagine with like third-party services, how do you make sure that you maintain accuracy and you're simulating the behavior of the real API? Because I imagine like there could be something where the third-party API, the payload changes slightly without your knowledge, and that could lead to essentially a test that passes, but in the real world actually breaks because of some sort of change that happened.
Yeah, this is a great question, because this is one of the sort of key objections or reservations that people have when they're considering adopting mocking as an approach. There's a number of solutions to this now that you can employ. So I've seen some teams who will they just have a kind of a process that will record essentially take a recording of the real API and then store it as a mock that can then be sort of played back later for use in their tests. So because they're kind of regularly kind of pulling a mock from the real thing, it remains accurate that way. We support in Wiremock Cloud. I haven't mentioned this yet, but we'll get to it. But you can import an open API specification. So if you're working in a sort of API design process in your organization that produces open API or uses it as a sort of specification standard, then you can import it, and that will again kind of ensure that at least as long as your specification is accurate, then your mock API will be up to date. And there's sort of an emerging set of practices around consumer-driven contracts as well. I think that's the other, or contract testing more generally. So the Spring Framework's contract testing framework will emit Wiremock mock APIs kind of as an output of its process. So as you're running contract tests with the Spring tool, then it will just produce your mocks for you while it's doing that. And again, because you're running these regularly against the real thing, and because you're doing a bunch of validation against that API kind of while you're doing it, it gives you this very high level of confidence that the mock that you've kind of emitted at the end of it is true to the real thing.
In the case where you're using like an open API spec, are you able to not only make sure that essentially the schema of the payload is correct, but can you actually generate fake data based on the open API spec that you can mock against?
Yes, so we do that in a couple of different ways. So we'll try and use your examples if you've got some in there as a preference. Mm-hmm. But if you haven't provided any examples, then we can generate them from the schema, provided the schema has got some sort of fidelity to it. And we try and make educated guesses about, even if the schema is a bit vague. If you say if a field name has got email in it, then we'll generate you an email rather than just a random string, that kind of thing. So yeah, the short answer is yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then, besides this problem that we're talking about, where you could potentially run into a case where, essentially what you're testing against is not true to the production system. And it sounds like there's, a number of different ways to handle that. But what are some of the other challenges or limitations that someone who's using API mocks needs to be aware of?
I think the thing that can be most surprising to newer users of it is the sort of statelessness of it. So, with a real API that sort of read write, you might often find that you read some resource back. I mean, the example I always use for sort of demos and so on is the to-do list. So you read the to-do list and it's got 0 items in it. You post a new to-do item, and then you read it a second time and it's got 1 item in it. And a real API which is stateful and has business logic and all of that, you would expect to essentially play back whatever data you posted to it kind of in the previous call. Mm-hmm. Mocking, as I say, but by virtue of the fact that it's just this kind of stateless sort of matching of request patterns to responses, by default sort of won't do that. It won't store your state, and it won't sort of serve it back to you at the end. So you have to plan your testing activities a little bit more carefully around what state you need the mocked API to be in order for the test case to work. There are sort of more advanced techniques you can use to mitigate that to some extent. So Wiremock has this concept of scenarios, which is essentially a finite state machine that will simulate the sort of moving of resource from one state to another, so that you can sort of loosely simulate that situation I talked about, where you've added something to the to-do list, and then the next time you fetch it, there's something in there.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah. And then are there situations where an engineering team might want to use a combination of API mocks as well as like hitting an actual API during development for testing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would never advocate attempting to completely replace integration testing with mocking. I think there's always a need to test across integration boundaries in software. I don't think that requirement ever goes away. What mocking allows you to do is to sort of substantially reduce your dependence on that, and reduce the as I say, reduce the friction that creates on your team while they're working, and usually limits the number of things that the range of problems that you end up having to find during that integration testing to a much smaller finite set, rather than kind of relying on it for absolutely everything you do.
Mm-hmm. And then what is the typical process for incorporating API mock testing into a deployment model, or like a CI/CD, or how do those systems typically work and integrate with existing sort of deployment models that teams might be using?
So there's a few different ways to do it. One is kind of embedding straight into unit tests.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a Java developer, because Wiremock server is Java based, you can just kind of drop an annotation into your JUnit test, and it will start the server up in the background, do a load of configuration, so it's just kind of ready to go. And then you can create your mock API definition by programmatically via the API. So that's one way of doing it. There's some ways of doing it for non-Java. You can start it up in Docker and kind of run it kind of right next to your app under test in Docker, and test that way. And I suppose the other major way is if you're testing in a more integrated fashion. So if you're actually deploying into an environment and you want to test in the sort of in the environment that's representative of what you'll ultimately be deploying to, you can deploy kind of running instances of your mock APIs within that environment, and then configure the service or services that you're testing to kind of point to those mocks rather than where they would be normally. Often that means just kind of changing configuration files so that the base URLs or domains or whatever point to your mock APIs rather than whatever the real API domain would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I want to talk more about the details around Wiremock and the engineering, but maybe before we get there, besides people using Wiremock or maybe other off-the-shelf products, are teams also doing sort of their own solutions to this? Are they creating essentially their own mocking systems rather than using something like Wiremock?
Yes, certainly you see that some of the time.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a sort of thought process that goes, well, I only need this for a couple of API calls, nothing fancy. So I'll just stand up a whatever micro web framework it runs in my technology stack.
Mm-hmm.
And just hard code a couple of responses, and this works fine at first, and then it kind of grows and gets more complicated, and it starts being a piece of software that has to be maintained in its own right. And often at that point, people go, actually, hang on, we need to pivot to something which is attempting to do this properly, rather than sort of endlessly maintaining this growing piece of software just for doing mocking.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of engineering stories start that way, where it's, we only need this, so we'll just build it ourselves, and then fast forward 6 months, a year, suddenly they have need an entire team to just maintain this thing to keep up with.
Yeah. Yeah, you're exactly right. It's the same story that you hear in everything, and I think coupled with a little bit of engineering hubris as well. That sense of like, oh, that's easy. I could build that in an afternoon.
Right. Yeah, it's the secondary cost that people kind of forget about, which is the maintenance, and then as these systems get adopted, just like the scale and robustness of it, and it becomes this thing that's like death by a thousand cuts essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And there's the sort of the overhead associated with having something bespoke and having every time someone new joins your team, it's like, okay, if you want to write a new mock, this is how you have to do it, and if it's kind of unique to you and your team, then it's a learning curve, and it's not sort of reusable knowledge.
Right. Yeah, you're losing
the
that
benefit of using open source. Sorry, second.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that you're losing essentially, someone's. You're not taking advantage of someone's like prior experience because they're going and having to learn this new system each time.
Yeah, exactly. And furthermore, they're probably going to go, oh, this is something else bespoke I'm going to have to learn, rather than some transferable piece of knowledge I'm going to be able to take to my next role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So you've been working on Wiremock, the open source project, for quite a long time, over a decade now. So maybe you can start with, you've touched on some of the features of it, but how is that project unique from maybe some of the other types of mocking systems that are out there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's it's a combination of things, I suppose. I mean, it's first of all, we're I think at this point the only product on the market that is both a sort of an open source library and a fully hosted SaaS, and where there's a sort of migration path from one to the other as your needs kind of develop and grow and so on like that. Mm-hmm. There's I think a few design choices about sort of Wiremock specifically, maybe set it aside from some of the other tools. So the fact that everything within it can be done via its own API, and its own API is both file based and HTTP based and Java based, and actually now we've adopted a Python SDK as well. It kind of gives you this flexibility in terms of how you want to work with it, and particularly the sort of possibilities for interop that I think the sort of nice externalized kind of file format provided means that it's people like working with it because they can generate that with other tools, and they can read that with other tools and do other things with it. And it's even though it's runs on Java, it's kind of quite language agnostic by virtue of everything being integrated around this JSON format. I think those are probably the key points. I mean, it's quite sort of having been around for quite a long time. It's been contributed to by a lot of people. It solves a lot of those little sort of edge cases in terms of actually running these things, and it's quite feature rich as well. So the matching system is quite rich. There's a few things in the matching system that I don't think you can really do anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And likewise in the templating system as well, it's sort of quite sort of fully featured and solves a lot of those kind of niche cases that you don't trip over straight away, but you do after a few months or years of using it.
Yeah, so there's the open source version of Wiremock that you started, I believe, in 2011. And then now there's Wiremock, the company. So is Wiremock the company not only supporting, I'm assuming, the open source project, but then you also have essentially like a cloud hosted SaaS solution of Wiremock? And is that essentially what the company was formed to build and to go to market with? Yes,
that's correct. The main product is Wiremock Cloud. It was actually, there was a previous incarnation of it called Mock Lab, which is still live, but we're just kind of migrating everybody across now. And yeah, it's there to solve, if you want to host your mocks somewhere and you don't really want to have to think about how to do that, it solves that for you. So all the sort of hosting, DNS, all of that sort of nuts and bolts kind of hosting stuff it does for you. It provides a UI that gives you this sort of ability to edit mocks without having to get your head into either the sort of scripting or the sort of JSON representations of everything. There's a bunch of sort of interop with other formats, so you can import sort of Swagger, Open API, Postman, and so on like that. And sort of a few other kind of affordances like that. It sort of, I guess the thing about having the UI there as well is it enables this kind of exploratory testing workflow that is kind of hard to do with a sort of headless open source library. The way a lot of teams use it is, they'll have a kind of they're running app and they're running mock API, and they'll be able to just kind of cycle through a bunch of test cases by going in and making live changes to the mock, hitting save, trying something else in the app. So it gives you that sort of immediacy that you don't get when you're having to go through a kind of like change, deploy, wait, then test something kind of cycle.
Right. And, I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, where, there's teams that maybe they sort of DIY this because they don't think it's going to be that much effort. And then they end up, like spending a bunch of time and resources, like maintaining a project that's not like core to whatever the product offering is. Well, the open source project is like a better they're able to offload essentially the challenge of creating the software to using the open source. But it sounds like with Wiremock Cloud, then you're offloading even more of this in terms of you don't have to worry about standing up servers to run this and sort of the maintainability and the scalability of how you use Wiremock.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, and you mentioned scalability. I mean, we one of the things it explicitly offers is hosting, which is suitable for load testing. So some of our customers use it for for performance testing, and we provide them dedicated compute resources to that, so they know that it will just work, and they're not having to worry about sizing things themselves and performance tuning the process and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we can start with if I was interested in using Wiremock, like what is the process to actually getting started with it? And we can talk about Wiremock Cloud or the open source project, whichever sort of direction you want to take it.
Sure. So Wiremock Cloud, you can sign up for free, and if you go to wiremock.io, there's a start now for free button on there. If you click that, and you can sign in with your Google account or GitHub account, and you're essentially straight in there. You have a sort of pre-built example mock API you can browse around with and sort of kick the tires on, and then once you're in there, there's a few different things you can do. You can create stubs by hand by kind of just filling in the form. You can import, like I said, sort of your Postman collection or Open API. You can make a recording, so you give it kind of a target URL for another API and create some traffic through it, and it will record it. So there's a few different ways to get into it there. It's very, very straightforward. Mm-hmm. And kind of low friction to get into the cloud tool. If you want to get started with open source Wiremock, as I say, it kind of depends on what on your context and language stack. But the simplest way, if you're in the sort of Java ecosystem, is you can just drop in our JUnit extension into your test case. It's literally kind of one annotation, and then it will start everything up in the background and configure it for you. So it's just kind of ready to go, and you can work with it programmatically. And as I say, another approach is to run the Docker image, and just provide it with a file system full of these JSON files that define your stubs. So there's kind of something for everybody, really. Depending on your language stack and your whether you want something deployed in the cloud or running on your laptop.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the more complicated scenarios that I can testing scenarios that I can solve with Wiremock? So
I'm trying to think of a really gnarly one. I mean, I guess a good one is you can test. So let's say you have in your app that you're testing, you have like a client which has got a retry mechanism in it. So tries to make a request out to an API, and something blows up, and so it'll try again a couple of times before giving up. So fairly common kind of resilience mechanism in modern sort of service architectures. So if you want to write or even do an exploratory test to make sure that this retry is actually working, you can use the scenarios feature I mentioned earlier, the sort of state machine feature, to say, the first time I hit this API endpoint, I want to get a 500 error. Second time I hit it, I want it to disconnect the socket. But then the third time, I want it to succeed. Mm-hmm. And then you can test your app and say, well, if I've got a retry that says try 3 times before giving up, then I should get a reliable success at the end of that. So it's you can test cases, a whole load of sort of negative test cases like that. what are some other interesting ones? So we have an API template for a fully functioning OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect identity provider. It's actually sort of in the template library in Wiremock Cloud, so you can just kind of stand this up and use it, and that will essentially will simulate like a Google login or a Facebook login or anything that supports that kind of OpenID Connect login standard. But it does it all sort of statelessly and with smoke and mirrors. So whatever email address you log in with at the beginning, you kind of get it back at the end. And as far as your app's concerned, you've logged in with that email, but you don't actually have to have pre-created any user accounts or done any of that kind of stuff. And it's a lot faster than going around a real OAuth flow. So there's lots of other examples, but those are two good ones I think that spring to mind.
Yeah, the one with the OAuth is really interesting, and I imagine it would save a lot of time. What about something like, could you simulate like a race condition where one API comes back slower than expected or out of order or something like that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways you could do that potentially. There's if you wanted a sort of a deterministic race condition, then you could set fixed delays on things so you could guarantee that this one is always going to happen after this one. Alternatively, if you wanted to do a more sort of stochastic kind of test, where you're trying things lots of times and ensuring that some invariants are always the same, then you can randomize the delays. So you can say this stub should return in between 100 milliseconds and 800 milliseconds. So you can randomize a load of them, and that will obviously have the effect of meaning that they'll return in different orders if they're being fetched concurrently.
And you mentioned earlier, we touched on a scalability with and how Wiremock Cloud can scale. Can you maybe dive into that a little bit deeper? Like, how does Wiremock go about handling like a large number of API mocks or doing something like load testing?
So Wiremock Cloud has a sort of a kind of multiple host model. So it has it can have as many of these sort of host processes as you want to set up attached to the kind of main controller, and then you can farm the APIs out to them and spread them out in a way that makes sense. Both in terms of kind of location and the size of the host and all that kind of thing. Right now, we scale those hosts upwards, but we're working on also being able to scale the individual hosts horizontally. So there's a few ways in which we achieve that. I mean, the one of the benefits of mocking actually is it's really efficient. Because it's just kind of pattern matching requests and returning canned responses. There's no calling of downstream APIs. There's no sort of database round trips, any of that kind of stuff. So the actual sort of cost of serving an individual call is very, very low, and that means you can get a lot of throughput from quite a small amount of sort of compute resources.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And then, what about? So you've been working on the open source project for a long time, but what was sort of involved with moving that into the SaaS-based solution? Like, was that a tricky, essentially, migration of this open source project to essentially productionizing that or productizing that into a hosted solution?
So it kind of happened over a fairly long period of time, really. So the original so like I mentioned, MockLab was the original SaaS solution that I built, and I kind of built it mostly as a sort of solo side endeavor initially, and I started working on that back in 2016, and sort of. I like I say, I was self-funding it at the time, so I didn't get this kind of big onslaught of customers and traffic immediately. I put it out there and sort of started gently kind of marketing it initially through the open source site, and I think that sort of gradual build up allowed me to to sort of iterate on it and get feedback from customers and make it sort of more and more robust as time went along. And I think it was a lot of there were a few years of sort of tweaking the engineering and production by the time we got to kind of pivoting to Wiremock Cloud. So Wiremock Cloud is sort of benefiting from that that period, I guess.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds like it started. You essentially like worked through gradually a lot of the challenges early with a side project, and then you were able to move faster essentially once you started doing this as more of like a company initiative. What about looking back on this history of working on this project? What are some of the biggest engineering challenges that you've had to overcome?
That's an interesting question. I think the sort of diversity of weird problems that people, that your end users can produce when you're building a solution like this, can be quite challenging. So I found, particularly with customers who are doing performance, using MockLab or Wiremock Cloud for performance engineering, the sort of performance profiles that different organizations with their different requirements will generate, can vary wildly. And there've been a number of times when something in the monitoring has just gone crazy, and I've been staring at it going, what on earth are they doing with this? And it's been quite a good education in kind of server side kind of performance engineering for me personally, because there's been a lot of ad hoc profiling and sort of panic remediating of these performance problems that I just didn't anticipate during when building things. I mean, I suppose to give a concrete example, the matching system in Wiremock, there's lots of different ways that you can match incoming requests. You can do really simple stuff like just saying it's just the method and the URL path that we care about and nothing else, which is very efficient. But you can also say, I want to compare these two 500 node JSON documents for semantic equality with each other, and that sort of thing can get very expensive. And you'd find there are some organizations who built very complex APIs that relied really heavily on these sort of big heavy match types, and the cost of serving an individual request consequently would just go through the roof. So it was a mixture of, in those cases, I suppose, a mixture of engineering and kind of coaching customers on how to build efficient mock APIs, and not build ones that were going to degrade in performance due to sort of overuse of stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. And then can you also essentially test different versions of the APIs, both internal and third party?
Yeah, I suppose you can, because you can mock any, you're mimicking an API's behavior. There's nothing to stop you kind of capturing multiple versions, running a mock sort of ahead of what's in production, that kind of thing. I guess we may get to this slightly later, but there's a fairly sort of common pattern of usage that I see, which is about building the mock out ahead of the real API being implemented. So if you have version 2 is in production, but version 3 has got all these extra features, and you need them to build something in your app, then you can mock them as soon as the specification has been agreed with the producing team.
Mm-hmm. So are people using Wiremock as a sort of lo-fi way to design an API, so they can start with essentially with just a spec, mock out the responses, and then actually use that to with real users or some subset of tester users to get feedback and then iterate on that design?
Yeah, we absolutely see that amongst some of our customers, where you have a sort of producing and consuming team, or maybe several teams that have to come together and integrate around an API. Mm-hmm. And in some cases they'll go into a meeting room, and rather than kind of whiteboarding the API design, they'll just throw it straight into Wiremock Cloud, and that will become the kind of the reference for the producing team to work from. But also it will mean the consuming team can immediately start building client code against it, and validating that the design is kind of up to the job. Mm-hmm. And the great thing about that is this sort of shortening of the feedback loop. It means that the consuming team can say, hey, actually there's a field missing, or I can't work with the data in this format, can we change it to this? Very early in the process, before the producing team have kind of committed to implementing a particular design.
Right. And that also helps with generating the API references and helps the documentation team. So essentially everybody can be moving immediately rather than kind of waiting for things to be fully implemented.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really valuable thing to have. A real productivity sort of booster. If you have that kind of short feedback loop where you're really putting an API design to the test, by actually writing code against it. Because I think that there are certain we've all done this, I'm sure. You go into a room and you design an API and everyone goes, yeah, great, that looks like it's everything we need. And the second you go and sit down at your desk and write the first bit of client code for it, you go, no, actually this is completely wrong, we need it to be this way instead. Mm-hmm. And what you don't want is to have to sit on your hands for a couple of weeks, well, even before you've got to that point, but while the producing team ships something and to then say, no, actually this is completely wrong. Ideally you want to iron out all those bugs in the first few hours or the first couple of days of your sprint, whatever you're doing, and by the time you've implemented the API fully, you've got this high level of confidence that it's really the one you need.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's tons of scenarios where things look great in an Eng design doc or on a whiteboard somewhere, and then when it comes to actually like using it, that's kind of when things start to see the cracks in the seams to some degree. So what's next for Wiremock? What are some of the things that you're excited about?
So yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff really. So right now we're working on kind of a chaos feature, I suppose you'd call it. So the ability to produce kind of randomized errors, and it's just intended to make sort of injecting a little bit of chaos into your testing really simple. So you can just kind of switch it on, turn the sort of failure rate up to a certain level, and then just kind of see what happens. And it's building on features that Wiremock has had for a while around being able to return faults of various kinds, but just simplifies the process of randomizing it. So that should be live, sort of next week maybe. There's a bigger thing that we're working on as well, which is I think is has got the potential to be hugely useful to teams doing this stuff, and really sort of pulling a thread through the whole kind of API life cycle, which is we already accept open API as a kind of an input format, but where we're trying to get to is to essentially kind of close the loop, so be able to generate open API from mock APIs, and also to then validate in real time sort of the mock against the open API spec to detect any drift between the two. And what that enables us to do is to generate a developer portal for your mock environment. So your team have built a bunch of mock APIs, and then there's other people in your organization who need to consume them. And if there's just this kind of nicely auto-generated portal that they can use to access it, then it'll make it sort of 10 times easier than having to go and ask you about it or whatever. So that's one thing, and also the other thing that this will enable is integration with API gateways and design tools, and essentially all this rich ecosystem of tools that all integrate around the open API spec. So that's the next big thing that's coming up.
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of exciting efficiency gains potentially for users of the Wiremock. Is there anything else that you want to share? Anything else the audience should know?
I suppose one thing that springs to mind is I guess there's one use case we haven't talked about all that much, which is that we're now also starting to see some of our customers do, which is a kind of we're trying to find the right terminology for this at the moment, but I suppose we call it developer enablement. If you're an organization who delivers APIs as part of your product offering to usually to people outside of your organization, and you're trying to create a good developer experience for those people. What we're now seeing some of our customers doing is building mock APIs and putting them behind their own documentation portals, all of that kind of stuff. So similar to what I was just talking about, but sort of the kind of public facing version. And by doing that, so like I mentioned, sort of right at the beginning of our conversation, there are lots of organisations that will put sandboxes out there that are not working a lot of the time, or they're hard to configure in terms of data, or they're they're unreliable and hard for your customers to work with. And a good sandbox, I think, is a sort of linchpin to a good developer experience. So if that's what you're trying to achieve and deliver to your customers, then putting mock APIs behind your behind your API portal as the sandbox can kind of ensure there's that sort of reliable and consistent experience for your developers when they make their kind of first touch with your APIs.
Right. Yeah. And that also allows people to do some simple things like the load testing that you mentioned, or do like the chaos testing of like, hey, we're just going to spit back a bunch of random errors and see how your system actually handles that. Because other than building out the mock APIs yourself for that, that might be a hard thing to do even against a sandbox environment, even if it's well designed.
Yeah, exactly. It's it enables a whole load of discovery and testing activities for the developers consuming your APIs that they'd struggle to get access to otherwise.
Yeah, and it's a shortcut for these businesses that want to create a great developer experience without having to essentially build out like really robust, fantastic sandbox environments. They can shortcut it by using this Wiremock experience.
Yeah, exactly.
So awesome. Thanks for coming on, Tom. It was it was great. I think there's probably you've been working on this problem for a long time, so it's clear that you have a very in-depth knowledge and experience in mocking APIs. And thanks for coming on and sharing your years of experience working on this. And I think it was a great conversation, and I'm sure the listeners will enjoy it.
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me. It was great talking to you about it.
Cheers.
Cheers.